Hi, I'm Paula Droege, and this video is an overview of my book, Evolution of Consciousness, Representing the Present Moment. When I talk to people about consciousness, I find that trying to explain it is like building a house of cards. Each component is essential to the whole, but different people are interested in different particular elements. But if you take away one card of the house, then the whole falls over. What I want to do is build a structure of explanation that shows how each card fits together to make the whole house. I don't expect to convince you that my explanation is correct. The puzzle of consciousness has been around for a really long time. But I want to show you how an explanation is possible, because many people think that there is no possible way that we could explain this exciting experience of consciousness in terms of something physical like a brain and a body in an environment. The first card, the foundational card, is the solution to the explanatory gap. And here's a quote from Thomas Nagel to articulate exactly what the problem is in the explanatory gap. We have at present no conception of what an explanation of the physical nature of a mental phenomenon would be. Without consciousness, the mind-body problem would be much less interesting. With consciousness, it seems hopeless. At this point, we have a lot of good explanations for a lot of different mental phenomena. We have a good sense of how memory works, about learning, and we can see how a brain can perform these kinds of functions. But we're still struggling with consciousness. There are still a lot of questions about how exactly consciousness functions. And so the main card is the solution to the explanatory gap of understanding how possibly something like a brain could produce something like consciousness. So the first card is the foundational card, explaining how something like consciousness could be explained in terms of brain function. But that card is resting heavily on the other four cards. The second important card is the card of representationalism, and that's the idea that the mind, what it is to be mental, is to represent. And this idea was developed by a philosopher named Franz Brentano. And there's wide agreement that the mental is explained in terms of representations, that what it is to be a mind and how minds are different from physical things like bodies is that the mind, unlike bodies, can represent things. There can be a relation of aboutness. So when I have a thought about something like this green brain, then I'm thinking of green things and I'm thinking of brain things, and what it is to have a thought about a green brain is to represent things that are green and brains. There are lots of different ways to interpret what this aboutness sort of relation comes to. Franz Brentano had what's known as an internalist view of representation, in that he thought that consciousness, the mind, is what determined this representational relationship. I support the opposite view, what's known as an externalist view of representation, that what it is for me to have an idea about or a representation of something is that it's related to something outside of my mind, or at least outside of the representation itself, that something represents something that's external to that representational relation. So my representation of the green brain is something that represents it because it's about it, not that there is a particular system of representations or map in my mind that mirrors the world in a particular way. It's because it's connected to it. I'll say more in a moment about exactly how I think that representation, something in my mind, something in my neural system in particular, manages to get to become a representation of an external object. The second thing that I think is important about representations and my way of thinking about representations is that it's not a picture theory. So it's not a map about the world, it doesn't picture the world, it is connected to the things in the world that it represents. And then the third element of my view of representation is that it serves a biological function. What's important about my system of representation is that it does things, that it does serve a function in terms of helping me represent things in the world that are green brains, and it's hard to imagine that there could be a biological reason to represent green brains. It seems like not a particularly biologically useful thing to represent, but I'm going to argue that that's what my representational system does, that it evolved in order to have the function of representing things in the world, even weird things that you wouldn't think would be important to my survival value, like green brains. So the third important card in my house of cards is the particular theory of representation that I think is useful in both thinking about what a mind is and also particularly useful in thinking about how consciousness serves a function. So the Consumer Semantic theory of representation, developed by Ruth Garrett Millikan, argues that what a representation is an item that serves some function. That the specifics here are that a representation varies isomorphically with the item it represents. That's the first condition. So I have some item, some set of neurons, or some single neurons. I tend to think it's going to be some set of neurons that stands for this item in the world, and what item it is. So there's going to be some set of neurons that stands for the green feature, some set of neurons that stands for brains, and maybe some combination of that or some other way. This is what the neuroscientists will figure out, is exactly which sets of neurons, exactly how the brain does this work. But there is some way in which sets of neurons stand for this particular green brain. And what that means is that this set of neurons varies in relation to this. So when I shift it around, or when I learn new information about it, whatever it is that's doing the representing of green and brains and this green brain shifts in relation to the information that I learn about this green brain. So that's the variation relation. And then the second important condition is that it does this because this covariation relation has been beneficial in the past. So somehow I've developed a brain system that varies in relation to things in the world because those covariations relations have helped me. And this again seems weird, like how could my brain have evolved to represent something weird like a plastic green brain? And the important aspect of that is to think about how evolution works to be useful for some things, and then it adapts over the course of time to do other things that it wasn't originally intended to do. So if you have a brain that has the function of representing in relation to things like red berries, that makes a lot more sense. I need to represent redness in order to distinguish between the red ripe berries and the green non-ripe berries, and I need to represent berries in order to keep track of the items that are berries, and that's useful because it's good to eat. So that system developed in relation to these useful, obviously useful sorts of things, but then once that system is in place, then it can be used to represent other sorts of things. So that's the kind of grounding notion to give mental representations this function of doing things in the world, of getting you to things in the world. This next point I want to make about the vehicle-content distinction in representation isn't a separate card, but it is an important distinction in order to understand how it could be that something like a brain could represent something like a green brain, even though it doesn't share any features in common. And even though I've called this brain, and they're both called brains, my actual physical brain really doesn't share any features. It's not even the same shape as this green brain. So how is it that something like a brain can represent things when it doesn't share any of the features of the things it represents? And so the vehicle-content distinction helps us understand how this happens. And so a good analogy suggested by Fred Dretske is the way in which a book represents content that is entirely unrelated to the features of the book. So a book is, let's say, made of paper and ink and is written in words that are shapes of the ink on a page of paper. But what that book represents, the book is the vehicle, it can represent the content of anything. So fairies is my example of the content here, that the book can represent these sprightly, mystical, magical beings that don't even exist, but the book can be this physical existent thing that's representing these other things that don't exist. So the book doesn't have fairies in it. There's no fairy dust in the book itself, but it can represent fairies and represent the existence of fairies and can tell you all kinds of things. It can, the book can be a vehicle that represents actual things. So it can be about historical events that actually exist, even though those historical events or those, ongoing events, ongoing things, are out there in the world. They're not in the book, so I can read a book about Washington, D.C., which really exists. I can read a book about the White House or people in the White House that actually exist, even though I'm not there, the book is not there. So the vehicle, like the neural system, can represent things that it doesn't, features that it doesn't share. So my neurons are not green. My neurons are not brain-shaped, although they are in a brain, but they can represent green things and brain things because of the vehicle-content distinction. An important feature of this biological view of representation is that a continuity can be drawn from very, very simple creatures and very, very simple forms of representation up to much more complex creatures and complex forms of representation. So here we have the nematode worm, and it has a very long name that's usually abbreviated C. elegans, and so that's what I'll call it here. It's a very simple organism, but it has a nervous system capable of basic forms of learning. And with just 300 neurons, the C. elegans is able to sense the chemical gradient in its environment, and it moves towards nutrients and away from toxins. And it does this by flexing and relaxing bands of dorsal and ventral muscle cells. So we have this very, very simple creature, but the sensory system of the C. elegans satisfies the two conditions of representation that I mentioned earlier. First, its sensory cells have the function of varying in relation to the features in its environment. So it varies, its sensory cells vary in relation to the toxins and the nutrients. And it does that because the covariation relation has been helpful. It's gotten it to food and pushed it away from negative things in its environment. So the sensory representation system has been useful in its past, and that's why it's a representation, and that's why its system does what it does. That's why it varies in accord with the items that it varies in accord with. And a person could debate the use of the word representation for very simple forms like this. Even Millikan herself suggested a gradation in terminology and preserved the word representation for more complex forms. But I like to use representation for very, very simple systems like this to reinforce this continuity from simple systems to more elaborate system, so that we can keep in mind that this is the basic distinction between being something that is mental and being something that is physical. And I think that that's especially important in thinking about AI, which will come up a little bit later. What is it that this system does that very, very simple biological systems do that physical systems like AI systems don't do? And being able to adapt in relation to its needs, I think, is fundamental to a mental system, fundamental to a representational system. In later work, Millikan then distinguishes among simple and more articulate forms of representation, and this distinction is between descriptive representations, which have the function of varying in accord to features of the world. So these are describing how things are. And the other is directive representations, which have the function of varying in accord with the way the world needs to be. So they're representing how things need to be in order for the system to be able to get what it needs. So initial forms, these more simple forms of representations, Millikan called push me, pull you representations, and they had both the descriptive and the directive element of representation connected together. So what happened in the world then told the creature what to do about that representation. So the C. elegans representation is a push me, pull you representation. You get the signal that, you're going in the direction of more toxin, and then it's immediate what your response needs to be. You need to go away from those toxins. You need to go in a different direction. Or you're getting the information that your descriptive representation is that there are more nutrients in this direction, and so the system has only one option, which is to follow that gradient of increased nutrients. And so what the development is when the descriptive and the directive representations can come apart, then it's possible for the creature to develop information about the world without responding in one way or another. There might be several different responses, several different directive representations that one could pursue when those two come apart. And so later I'll talk more about why that development is particularly important in relation to consciousness theory. But right now I just want to emphasize that the biological function of representation is central to my view of representation, and central, I think, to understanding how consciousness evolved from more simple forms like push me, pull you representations. So C. elegans, I'm going to argue, is not conscious. It represents, it has a mind, a very, very simple mind, in that it knows which ways to go. And one could even argue that very, very simple forms of representation, such as trees, have the capacity to represent where sun is. They have the capacity to represent where nutrients are and grow their roots in those sorts of directions. So organic systems are representational on my view because they have a biological function to vary isomorphically with things in the world. That kind of variation is useful for those organisms. And so that makes them very, very simple forms of mind, but not yet conscious forms of mind. So as I said, artificial intelligence is not mental because it doesn't have a biological function to survive. Its entire system is designed for the designer. It's designed in order to satisfy needs of us, the people who have created the systems. So my laptop is not conscious because it's doing things for me. It doesn't know what it's saying, it doesn't know what it's doing, because it doesn't have genuine representations. The way in which we can talk about its representational system, because it does represent. So, the words on the slides that I'm showing have meaning. They have meaning because they have meaning for the users of the system. So devices like laptops do represent, but they represent in a derived way. They're based on, they're dependent on the minds of humans for that meaning to be produced and for that meaning to be used. So on the consumer theory of representation, meaning is determined by use, by what use it's served. So we're the ones that use AI technology, and so we are the ones that determine that it has meaning, to the extent that it does have meaning. For the machines themselves, there is no meaning, there's no value to their representational capacities. Now, that doesn't mean that there never could be any meaning. It's possible for these systems to develop a meaning, that they might have uses for themselves. That, to me, is the critical question in whether AI is actually intelligent, or whether it is simply, an artificial system that's doing various functions. That's another question. I don't go into that much in the book, and I'm not going to go into that at all anymore here. But that, to me, is the fundamental question in terms of thinking about machine consciousness and artificial minds altogether, is what would it be for a machine to have a genuine representation? What would it be for it to have needs and uses of its own that would be reasons for itself to vary isomorphically in relation to the items that it represents, as opposed to varying isomorphically in relation to what we need it to represent?